Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining ADA and Gender and Disaster Australia for our webinar on the topic of gender and sexual minorities in disaster risk reduction. I would like to start this morning by acknowledging that I am hosting this event on the lands of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. For anyone who's not familiar, that is Ballarat, Victoria, and today the weather can't decide whether it is a beautiful sunny day or about to a storm. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining us from today, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I genuinely celebrate and am grateful for the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and the waters across Australia. So some housekeeping notes for those of you unfamiliar with our process. Today's event will be recorded and it will be made available after the event on both the ADA Knowledge Hub and on the Gender and Disaster Australia website. So I encourage you to use the chat window to say hello. Some of you are already doing that. Acknowledge the lands on which you are joining us from. And throughout the morning, you can share any thoughts or reflections on the content of today's webinar. As always, we'll be using our Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to take questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. And you can upvote questions in the Q&A by clicking the thumbs up button. And then at the latter part of the seminar, I'll do my best to ask the most hotly desired questions of our panelists. As always, I ask you all to remain respectful to one another and to our presenters when you're posting your comments and your questions today. So by way of introduction, we all know that extreme weather events and disasters do have some similar impacts within a community or a population. The repercussions, however, are personal, individual, and varied. Disasters affect each of us uniquely and both shape and are shaped by our experience of the event and its aftermath, and our ability to recover depends on a range of factors. These factors include our age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, physical and mental abilities, the places in which we live, our particular housing, any previous or existing trauma or stress in our lives, our gender identity, and our sexual orientation. As you can see, that is a complex set of factors, and the effect that these factors have on each of our lives and life experience isn't predetermined. They're largely dependent on a range of unequal and discriminatory practices that exist in our society, and we know that disasters can exacerbate existing inequality. Gender identity and sexual orientation play a pivotal role in an individual's susceptibility and in our individual resilience before, during, and after a disaster. Despite significant developments in gender-focused disaster research, there is more work to be done on the consequences of disasters for gender minorities. So today's seminar, we have a wonderful group of individuals who are going to share with you their work and no doubt inspire lots of conversation and questions from you. Today, our first two speakers will present to you a reference guide for incorporating gender and sexual minority research into disaster risk reduction. That's a mouthful. And I do need to acknowledge that both Maureen and Kevin are up in the middle of the night. So I have complimented them on how fresh as a daisy they both look this morning. It is very late in the UK. So they have developed this work at the Gender, Responsive, Resilience and Intersectionality in Policy and Practice Research team, another mouthful, at the University College in London. We'll then hear from Australian researchers and practitioners on the work that's taking place here in Australia. But first, let me welcome Maureen Fordham, who is the Director of the Centre for Gender and Disaster at the University College London, and Kevin Blanchard, Director of Disaster Risk Reduction Dynamics and an Associate of the University College London. The Centre for Gender and Disaster sits within the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction at the University College London. Over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And apologies that it looks very dark here. It is 1 o'clock in the morning. There are lots of lights on in the room, but it's not really showing up on the video. I hope you can see okay. So let me just do a very brief introduction to this work. And first of all, I do need to emphasize that this is very much a team activity. And you can see on the screen, you can see the main authors that did the majority of this work. Apart from Kevin and myself, there's Eshka, Zara, Jess, and Olivia. It would have been nice to have everyone here, but too many for our short time slot. So acknowledgement to all the team who put so much work into this. We also have to thank the funder, UKRI, that's the UK Research and Innovation, the Economic and Social Research Council, for funding the research that paid for the work to get done. I think you've got plenty of links elsewhere. I'll put a link into GRRIPP after I finish speaking. And everything's on our website, so please go to the GRRIPP website, gripp.net, for more information. So, you know, where did this come from? Well, we've always been interested in our Centre for Gender and Disaster in broadening the understanding of gender to be as inclusive as possible. And we wanted to really get a sense of what's out there in this research area. And this reference guide is one of a series that we do, which is a brief introduction to whatever the topic is for people coming into this area and not knowing anything about it. We did find, as we were doing this research, that the search terms we used were critical for what turned up, and you only had to change one small thing to find a whole different set of resources. We don't have time to talk in detail about that. Kevin will refer to it briefly. But it's certainly something we would like to follow up later with anyone who's interested in this work, to do something more exhaustive than where we have begun with this. We're sure that there's a lot more out there. We want to try and find work that tells us something about the research area, the theory behind it, but something that's very practical and useful for the end users of this research, for the emergency managers. And we want to try and identify some of the gaps. If I could have a look at the next slide, you'll see on the next slide a map with the areas that turned up, the areas of focus. These were the ones where particular locations were specified in the research. Often it was more general than that. And you can see that there are some gaps. We had 70 references that we selected in all. We're pretty sure there are more out there, and it would be great to follow up on this afterwards. So I'm going to stop there because I want to hand over to Kevin to explore a bit more about what we did and what we found. So I hand over to Kevin now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm sure everyone on this call today will realise how difficult and challenging terminology can be within our sector. Whether it's the way we assign the word natural to a disaster, which hopefully many of you will appreciate that that's not the case, or how we recognise different levels of vulnerability, exposure or risk within different groups, as Margaret alluded to at the beginning of the discussion. And the work around this particular piece really came down to terminology as well, and the phrases and the cultural and societal kind of influences around that terminology and those phrases. Next slide. So before we go into that, before I kind of discuss a bit more in detail what Maureen mentioned before around the search terms that we used in this reference guide, I wanted to give anyone who might not have any experience of gender and sexual minority community a bit of a kind of a high level overview of the different terms. So hopefully some of you, maybe many of you, would have seen the acronym LGBTQIA plus, or a variation of that, LGBT plus, LGBTQ plus, etc. And I just wanted to kind of explain what these letters mean and where they sit in the broad context of our discussions. So LGBTQA, or lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and asexual, refer to a person's sexual identity or sexual orientation. Next, please. The T and the Q refer to a person's gender identity. You'll notice that Q is both in the sexual orientation as well as the gender identity, and that's because queer, as the could be used in many different ways. It's, you know, all-encompassing. Next, please. Intersex are those born with differences in their sex traits and reproductive anatomy. And although this has nothing to do with sexual orientation or gender identity, what actually has been found through decades of research is that many of the hurdles and challenges that LGBTQI plus people face are actually experienced by intersex people. So as part of that kind of common goal of promoting inclusivity and acknowledging the challenges and the difficulties that this particular portion of society have, as well as the capacities, it was included within that particular definition. Next, please. And then lastly, we have the plus sign, which is really any other identity that's not considered cisgender, i.e. the gender that you're born with, or heterosexual or heteroromantic, i.e. attracted to the person of the opposite sex. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, terminology in itself is actually a really tricky issue, particularly when you're dealing with such a diverse and varied group of people within society. Next slide. So LGBTQI+, or the acronym that I'm using here, is primarily recognized within the global north, mainly in Western Europe and North America. But there are many other acronyms, many other abbreviations, depending on the region, local context, cultural influences, etc. And it may well be that there are parts of a community that we haven't included within our research because of time constraints, resource constraints, etc. So the phrase gender and sexual minority was used as an overarching definition for this particular piece of work on the reference guide. Next slide, please. And as you can see, just from a very partial list, and this isn't, I don't even think this is half of the phrases we searched for. As you can see, the search terms that we use for this particular piece of work are extensive. And they include things such as, you know, other acronyms. I never know how to pronounce it, but it's sexual orientation, gender identity, was also included. But then we also had things kind of a bit more abstract in terms of LGBT phobia, and also looking at kind of the issue of allyship within this particular discussion. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. So why did we do this? Maureen briefly touched on this before. What was it we were kind of hoping to get? And Maureen also mentioned the end user, you know, the type of work that we were hoping to share is really about trying to understand how emergency managers, disaster professionals, etc., consider gender and sexual minorities within their work. And that may well be that people are already doing that on the ground. And I know there are many organizations around the world that are actively including gender and sexual minorities within their disaster preparedness and response work. However, many are not. So this reference guide was really built as a kind of a way for emergency managers to dip their toe into the water of research and understand what's currently out there. Next, please. So just to kind of be, a bit more specific and take an example here, if we look at comms, so next, please. So comms within emergency management or disaster risk reduction have, a number of very similar traits. They have a number of similar areas that we all need to consider and look at in our day-to-day work. And that could be things such as language, privacy, training, and considerations around post-disaster care. Next, please. But then when we add the impacts and capacities and knowledge and risk and vulnerability of gender and sexual minorities, we start to then kind of put meat on the bones. We start to then understand some of the complexities that are involved in that. And the research that we found throughout the reference guide and the research that we collected with the help of the team, Maureen and others, really started to build up this picture and understand that, say, for example, language within, cisgender heteronormative society, language may have, a number of steps that we need to consider when dealing with comms and how it is that we need to, put our message across. We need to be inclusive of different ethnicities, different religions, etc. But what we also need to do, and as good emergency managers and practitioners should be doing, is understand that there are parts of the community that may need specific wording, language use to be able to incorporate their identities and their needs within the work that we're doing. So it could be that using gender neutral language in emergency communications has a much better response rate or a much better impact on gender and sexual minorities within the kind of the comms construct of disaster risk reduction. Next, please. So I'm conscious that we only have a very short amount of time. So I just wanted to say that there are a whole host of papers included in the reference guide. If you haven't already had a chance to look at that, please do, because honestly, I do genuinely think there's a paper in there for everyone and for any kind of area that you want to explore on that. One thing that we kind of noticed and we started to explore in collecting this information and building that information out were these kind of main themes. And what we started to see was, there's a lot of work happening around inclusion and recognition, recognizing that this community, this part of our society exists. Our diverse community really does need consideration when developing emergency management plans, policy, etc. But we also started to see things around intersectionality and understanding how an intersectional approach to risk and to preparedness and to response really does help build out and flesh out the response that we have as emergency managers to include gender and sexual minorities. And we also, again, one of the key themes that we had from this reference guide was understanding the role of agency and challenges and capabilities of the gender and sexual minority community in responding to disasters, and how, emergency managers and planners can learn from these communities in building a better response to all. As I have briefly mentioned, Maureen's also very quickly mentioned, the big thing that in terms of limitations was really our resource. It was a very small amount of funding for this particular piece of work. And we also had a team that was really very part-time. So we had very limited amount of time to work on this. We would have loved to have gone much further and explore some of the kind of the regional and national terminology and references. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible, but that's hopefully what we will be doing with that call to action that Maureen gave at the beginning. And then, for some of the gaps that we explored or we found through this particular piece of work, there were missing perspectives from gender and sexual minorities of color, predominantly tended to be Caucasian academics and researchers who are contributing to this discussion. That's not to say there aren't important voices out there that need to be heard. It's just at the moment, due to a number of societal and cultural issues, that's not happening. So we as practitioners and policymakers need to really push for that and actually encourage that to happen. And we also saw, as you would have seen from that map that Maureen showed at the beginning, a huge geographical discrepancy in terms of where the research was coming from, primarily Australia, Europe and North America, very, very little from Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, etc. And finally, the recommendations that we have as a team in the particular reference code documents is that we need to use our power, we need to use our resource and our networks and our energy to really push forward this discussion and take this discussion onto that next level of operationalizing this work, understanding how it operates on a day-to-day basis on the ground when we are responding to disasters. And just lastly, to quickly reiterate Maureen's call to action, we need everyone on this call today to really think about gender and sexual minorities in disaster risk reduction and emergency management. Consider how it is that you can better that particular work within your own personal context, and also understand if there's any contribution you can make to the broader research process. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maureen and Kevin. And clearly there could be a whole lot more conversation that you could take us through, but I appreciate that starter. And I'm noticing that a question has gone into the Q&A, so feel free, if you've got questions for Maureen and Kevin, to pop them in the Q&A. Our next speaker brings home the conversation to Australia a little further. So next we're going to hear from Dejan Grihalj-Tomasevic, I hope I've done your name justice, Dejan, on the work that Gender and Disaster Australia are doing to integrate consideration of gender into every stage of the emergency management cycle here. Dejan is an accredited trainer with Gender and Disaster Australia and has worked in a range of roles across the disaster management and recovery continuum. Over to you, Dejan.
Thank you, Maureen. And I'd like to acknowledge that I have the pleasure to present to you from the lens of the Turrbal and Yuggera people here in Brisbane today. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Gender and Disaster Australia, or GADAS for short, was originally established in 2015 as GADPOD, and it was grounded in the extensive qualitative research in the aftermath of the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. GADAS has since added to the growing global research demonstrating increased rates of gender-based violence during and after disasters, and has initiated a wide range of projects and research to inform knowledge, policy, and practice. This includes research focused on the experience of vulnerable groups, including women, children, the elderly, and the LGBTQIA+ community. GADAS is the leading national organisation offering evidence-based education, training, and resources to address and minimise the harmful impacts of gendered stereotypes during disasters. Next slide, please. GADAS has undertaken a wide range of research since 2015, which has focused on topics including the disaster experience of sexual and gendered minorities, identifying the needs of the LGBTQIA+ community before, during, and after disasters, as well as the emergency management sector's understanding of the community and their needs. What research and lived experience has informed us is that during and after disasters, members of the LGBTQIA+ community can face stigma, which manifests itself as insult, injury, discrimination, and violence. We've seen forced outings due to homelessness or having to return to adverse family dynamics due to the damage of our private safe spaces provided by our homes, as well as disrespect towards same-sex relationships and family structures. The research provides visibility of the community's needs, as well as challenges the heteronormative assumptions that inform emergency research and policy. Researchers also identified that promoting and the development of inclusive emergency services, as well as sector-wide organizational system, requires the promotion and inclusion of LGBTQIA+ issues in disaster research and policy. Research can influence the emergency management sector to improve inclusion, first by identifying in which ways the existing practices are harmful to both the organization as well as the community that they serve. Next slide, please. I've included some of the key definitions that GADAS utilizes. The one I wanted to expand upon today is diversity. Diversity is the noun that members of our community often hear and associate with. Diversity is a combination of the differences that shape our worldview, our perspective, and our approach. Diversity also recognizes, respects, and values differences provided by ethnicity, gender, age, race, ability, and sexual orientation. One of the key takeaways from when I did the training was the concept of intersectionality and how it relates to diversity. Intersectionality refers to how a person's experiences are collectively shaped, but not limited to race, socioeconomic background, sex, gender, and sexuality. This overlap or combination of differences makes up a person's unique identity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Charlotte. Thank you. LGBTQ community is very fond of descriptors. We have an extensive list of terms that describe a person's physical traits, social characteristics, and sexual preferences, which tells a story and can help make a compatibility assessment. And we get down to those nitty-gritty details in determining how much body hair a person has through those descriptors. Intersectionality considers how those aspects that make you determines how aspects of your life intersect and sometimes result in structural inequalities. So the framework starts with gender and then considers the following. And Charlotte, if you don't mind clicking through, race, sexuality, age, ability, culture, and religion, amongst other factors. Please note that this isn't an exhaustive list. What this framework can do is help us identify and consider how the drivers and impacts of discrimination and violence faced by the LGBTQ community overlaps with the violence and discrimination faced by women. Some of the key areas of overlap relate to the pressures to conform to rigid binary gendered stereotypes, pressures that are ramped up during and after a disaster. For example, what a woman is and what a man should be. GRRIPP does not claim that the drivers and impacts are the same for women and LGBTQIA+ persons, but rather that there are areas of overlap. When I consider my intersectionality umbrella, I acknowledge my cold background, my migrant background, a religious upbringing that didn't favor the LGBTQ community. And these factors signal to me that my sexuality was a vulnerability factor because I feared being outed, assaulted, and excluded from my family and culture. My family unit also doesn't reflect the heteronormative structure, which is a vulnerability factor that I didn't consider. And this relates to some of the structural inequalities that members of the LGBT community face. Just to contextualize this comment, when my husband and I had our daughter through surrogacy, that meant for the first year of her birth, we had a year-long legal process, which included mandatory counseling and getting professional references to legally adopt her and become her parents, essentially. What this meant was for that year, I couldn't make any medical or legal decisions. I needed stat techs to do skin-to-skin contact or have her vaccinated or to be able to have a discharge to me and bring her home. I couldn't imagine the additional complexities that an evacuation would bring, or not being able to access the healthcare facility where my GP knew my story, or simply applying for a personal hardship assistance grant for a child that I wasn't the legal guardian for. Next slide, please. So how do we address these challenges and risks? One of the answers is training. Training is a strategy utilized by GRRIPP to challenge assumptions and provide education through equal rights and participation in emergency services. The GRRIPP training program includes expert trainers and experienced facilitators that develop a wide range of practice-based resources, case studies, and training packages, both in person and online, to disaster responders, government organisations, and community members and other groups across Australia. Our training program has already reached 1,000 participants from the emergency services sector, government, women's health organisations, faith-based organisations, and disaster-affected community across the country. Another key value of the training program is the fact that representation is and always will matter. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community provide a unique perspective, including a wide range of innate resilience capabilities and adaptive skills. Additionally, our community encompasses the full spectrum of gender and sexuality, which provides a wide range of insights and perspectives. GRRIPP is here to continue to challenge the perceptions and provide best practice training and education. We would love to engage with any members listening in here today that would like to share your stories and look at undertaking the training and potentially become an accredited trainer in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, and so much in that presentation. And thank you for your generosity in sharing your story. I'm assuming you can see the reaction online to that story. So moving on, we will now hear from Dale Dominy-Howes, Professor of Hazard and Disaster Risk Sciences at the University of Sydney. Dale works at the interface between natural and human systems and considers disasters in terms of coupled human environment processes. His recent research projects have focused on marginalised communities, including sexual and gender diverse people. Now, unfortunately, Dale is unwell and did everything he could to be with us today and is unable to be present in person. He has very generously provided us with a pre-recorded video of his presentation. So Dale, when you're watching this later on, let me express my gratitude that you are still part of our seminar today and for all the work you do. So we'll now play Dale's pre-recorded video.
Hello and welcome. It's lovely to be here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation based in Sydney. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I know that this land was never ceded. I'd also like to thank the organisers for inviting me to attend this webinar and spend a few minutes talking to you about some of the work that the team I've been a part of has been working on over the last decade or so. So turning to the origins, inspiration and needs for this work, the emerging field of queering disasters, as I'm going to describe it, is founded on two fundamental pillars of work. The first comes from critical feminists who sought to understand the differential impacts of disasters on cisgender female girls and women in disasters, which were manifestly different from that of men. The other pillar upon which queering disasters stands, which I think perhaps sometimes is overlooked, is the activist and health service response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic that began in the 1980s. Very much represents a disaster that differentially impacted lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, intersex and other people. Queering disasters as an area of study seeks to expand our understanding of the effects of, we'll say, natural hazards, disasters, climate change and humanitarian crises and by disrupting heteronormative understandings of the impacts of those events and the binary of male-female and straight and non-straight, heterosexual and other. To keep it simple, we could get tied up in acronyms. I'm going to use queer for the remainder of my short talk, but I'm referring to a diverse set of communities of people of different sexual orientations and identities and sexual expressions and gender expressions and sex characteristics. In the West, we tend to collapse these various categories into the acronym LGBTIQA+, but I do want to acknowledge that's very much a Western notion that is not shared by people in all parts of the world. So together with colleagues, and I do quickly want to acknowledge that I've been privileged to work with friends, mentors and colleagues, particularly Andrew Gorman-Murray and Scott McKinnon, and I pay tribute to them and dedicate this short presentation to them as well. As a team, for a bit over 10 years, we've been exploring the impacts of disasters in Australia and New Zealand on the queer community. We've looked at a range of disaster types, and we've looked at the various impacts and effects. Now, we've been very fortunate and been able to publish quite a lot of work over the last decade or so. But in relationship to some of the issues that I would like to acknowledge as we've gone along on this journey together, I'll start with the positive. There are actually really wonderful stories and accounts of resilience, adaptive coping, capability, capacity of the queer community itself, coming together, supporting one another, extending the hand of friendship through families of choice and connected queer networks. I'd also like to be honest and say we've uncovered wonderful stories of really sensitive and caring emergency management professionals and workers who've been sensitive to the experiences of queer people in various disasters. And they've been really uplifting stories, and they provide a model of adaptability, capacity, and resilience that can be readily transferred to other vulnerable groups within our societies. But also along the way, and we've been fortunate enough, as I say, to have published many publications and book chapters, and you can look at the kind of results that we've published elsewhere. But a couple of take-home messages about issues along the way. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the research topic itself, queering disasters, has come under considerable attack from a number of areas. One is the right-wing media, which has been particularly problematic in terms of attacking both the research problem itself and, interestingly, researchers and activists themselves who've actually been undertaking that research. And you'll see one example there on some of the issues on the way, where we refer to the issues of attacks by other people on the concept of queering disaster research and professional practice. Lastly, in terms of issues along the way, I just wanted to briefly state that, again, both positively and negatively, one of the things that we've uncovered in our research is the reliance on faith-based organisations to provide services to the queer community has actually been somewhat problematic, particularly here in Australia. Just to provide context, the emergency management agencies that provide preparedness, response and recovery arrangements before and after disasters are run by the various states and territories that make up Australia. Now, the primary issue is that many of those states and territories outsource the provision of preparedness and, in particular, response and recovery services to third-party agencies, and those have traditionally been faith-based. And the issue is those faith-based organisations have sought and been granted exemptions from anti-discrimination laws. So this has resulted in some instances where, in one case, a lesbian couple with their child presented to an evacuation shelter during a disaster because their home was unsafe. And the person at the door conducting the check-ins for that lesbian couple appeared somewhat judgmental, in fact was very judgmental. And the two lesbians decided that in fact they would turn away and return to their damaged home because they considered it safer to be in that place than in the emergency shelter. And so faith-based organisations have presented something of a problem. But we do also want to say there are examples of faith-based organisations doing, and individuals doing, wonderful work. So there are some challenges for the emergency management workforce. We recognise that as an organisation, it is hyper-masculine. It's dominated by essentially straight white men here in Australia, despite our enormous diversity. There are barriers to getting into the emergency services for many individuals, and many members of the queer community find it difficult to be their authentic, open selves in the hypermasculine environment. Emergency service organisations, to be more inclusive, need to develop policies, procedures and practice with real teeth and accountability and consequences. And there needs to be zero tolerance for trans, homo and biphobic behaviours. And having things like Pride March Day or Pride Day and marching in the Sydney Mardi Gras as an organisation is in and of itself not enough to make an emergency management organisation queer inclusive. And finally, turning to solutions and opportunities. I really want to acknowledge that the emergency services do an outstanding job in Australia under difficult circumstances with limited resources. And like our wider communities, I remain enormously grateful for what they do. However, in the last few years, together with GAD-Oz, Andrew, Scott, and I, and many others were able to assist in the development of new gender inclusion guidelines for emergency management professionals. And these are very similar to the new tools that the University College of London group have developed. And for emergency management professionals, we encourage you to utilize those tools. You don't have to reinvent the wheel yourselves, and there's many excellent resources to support you to be able to do the work you need. And lastly, and in conclusion, there are many queer organisations that have huge resources, networks, and capability to be able to support you and act as a bridge between the emergency management and queer communities. And there are even faith-based organisations and queer-friendly church organisations that would be able to be part of that process of building resources and tools and networks to support disaster response in the queer community. So thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
And thank you, Dale. A very thought-provoking presentation. I thank you for putting that together for us. Our final speaker today is Dr. Tegan Larron, a research fellow at the Monash University Lab, XYZ Lab. Tegan is actively engaged in various projects focused on gender-based violence and has recently worked with the Gender and Disaster Australia, GAD-Oz, examining women and gender and sexual minorities and disasters. Over to you, Tegan.
Thanks so much for inviting me here today to talk about this important issue. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands I'm speaking from today. I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders past, present and emerging. I also recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are leaders in working to address the disproportionate levels of violence enacted against them, their children and their families. So yeah, it was really great to see, reading through the reference guide, the emphasis that this guide is in addition to, not instead of, established gender and disaster discourse. I recently reviewed the gender and disaster literature from the past decade and came to a similar conclusion. The research shows, and this guide highlights, the important contributions to understanding the particular vulnerabilities and resilience of gender and sexual minorities, as well as the need to consider gender and sexual minorities at all stages of disaster. This research builds on decades of work establishing the various ways women are more negatively impacted and generally more likely to be injured and lose their life as a result of disaster than their male counterparts. But crucially, it also identifies and examines the ways gender as a construct operates more broadly, and also how this impacts men. For example, the ways hegemonic masculinity hinders men in seeking assistance and support, which can lead to devastating effects. Also evident in the literature is a tension between structural and agentic perspectives and understandings of gender as a concept. So by that I mean scholars taking a structural perspective see gender as primarily relational, so masculinity and femininity are constructed in relation to each other. Deb Parkinson explains how this plays out in the context of disaster, where she says men are expected to protect and provide, and women to sacrifice and nurture. So from this view, gender is seen as a social structure that informs every aspect of social life, including institutions, organisations, and so on. Gender from a structural view is not seen as simply a biological dichotomy between male and female, or an individual and very personal identity, but rather a broader social pattern. Scholars from this perspective take the dominant construction of dichotomous gender as central to analysis, despite acknowledging complexities and that individual experiences of gender might not align with this dichotomy. So on the other hand, those taking an agentic perspective see the traditional concept of gender as limiting. They argue that the male-female dichotomy is an insufficient construct with which to address the gendered dimensions of disaster, And because of the existence of gender and sexual minorities, so the people who fall outside traditional binary constructions, scholars drawing on agentic perspectives have argued further that binary gendered conceptions and language erases and exclude the lived experiences of gender and sexual minorities. And it follows that dichotomous gender constructions, not only in policy and practice, but also in conceptual analysis, then cause further marginalization of groups that are already marginalized. So the proposed solution is to move beyond the binary and away from a central focus of gender as dichotomous. So this is in conflict with structural perspectives, which argue for the continuing importance of dichotomous agenda as an analytical category. These are two oppositional theoretical perspectives that are evident in literature, and both are valid. I tend to agree with the structural perspective that to fully understand the impact of the gender dichotomy and its consequences, including the experiences of gender and sexual minorities, it must remain the focal point of analysis. Further shifting away from the established gender dichotomy as a central point of analysis risks diverting attention from the significant marginalization experienced by women under prevailing gender norms. And although women were an early focus of this field of research, the problems have not been solved, unfortunately. So a recent example that comes to mind is the aftermath of the Northern Rivers floods in New South Wales in 2022, where men were able to exploit the lack of proper triage and separation at emergency centres and subject women to violence and sexual assault. This really highlights for me the critical need to further expose the entrenched power dynamics that perpetuate inequality and oppression based on gender. So the tension between structural and agentic perspectives really underscores the need for a comprehensive approach that considers both the individual and the structural dimensions of gender and sexuality in the context of disaster. And I think we can do both, as the guide says, in addition to, not instead of. So by recognising and addressing these complexities, gender and disaster research can contribute to a more inclusive and equitable disaster management and response framework. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Tegan. I love all the reactions. There's so much in each of the presentations by each of the panelists today. So a sincere thanks to Maureen, Kevin, Diane, Dale and Tegan for sharing all of your insights with us today. Really appreciate it. And there's a great deal of interest and gratitude, as you can see. We do have a couple of questions that we have time for. And interestingly, I'm going to go to a technical question first. It's not the most popular one, but a quick answer. For people who would like to be able to get behind walls to access research that you normally have to be a university student or an academic to do so, stay tuned. Ada has been negotiating quietly behind the scenes, and as followers of Ada, we're looking at a solution that will mean that you will be able to get behind that wall. And so stay tuned via Ada updates or reach out to us if you don't currently receive that. We are working very hard to give you access to research. So another question, though, I would like to acknowledge that we've got a number of people on our seminar today in the audience from overseas, and we are accustomed to having our friends in Aotearoa, New Zealand join us. But today we have a question coming all the way from Nigeria. And thank you for getting up late at night, Tosin, in Nigeria. So we're all pretty aware that things are even more difficult than they are in Australia for sexual minority groups in countries like Nigeria in Africa. So the question I'll read as it's written. It's evident a lot of sub-Saharan countries in Africa, majority of countries in Africa, aren't receptive to the realities of sexuality. The fact is that the LGBTQ community exists amidst us and they have rights. How can local organisations in the region better prioritise this important population in disaster risk reduction planning and implementation? And given what Tegan was just saying about what's happening in Australia, I think that pretty much could be broadened to how can local organisations do this better regardless of where we are? Now I'm going to rely on one of you to be brave, and because I'm not quite sure which of you to throw this at. Any suggestions? Maybe Kevin. Yep.
I mean, it's a fantastic question. It's a question that every time I've done training on this particular topic, it's always the question that's asked. How should local organisations, community groups, etc., be doing this, particularly in countries with challenging cultural and legal, in some cases, contexts? I don't have an answer, because obviously each country is different. How someone operates, I mean, one thing I would say is a piece of research I did outside of the reference guides back in 2020. We actually interviewed a couple of organizations from sub-Saharan Africa, one based in Uganda, which was absolutely incredible considering what's just recently passed in Uganda, and one in Kenya. So there are organizations in these countries who are doing the work. Now, how they do that, obviously, just for very quickly, the particular organization we spoke to in Uganda, they wouldn't give us their real name. They used an anonymous email to contact us. It was all very, very secretive. Understandably, there were, genuine risks to them and their families and their friends if they were to be published within this particular piece of research. So there are, organizations operating, but they tend to be operating in a way that's very under the radar. So again, kind of not really an answer. It's just to say that there is stuff happening. From my own context here in the UK, we've got, unfortunately, a very transphobic, non-binary, gender-phobic press and government currently. So even large organizations, there's an organization over here called Mermaids, there's an organization called Stonewall, who are actively pushing for inclusion and engagement with gender minorities. And they are being demonized by the press and by governments. So, even in so-called liberal, maybe more inclusive countries, there are these huge pressures that are being faced by our community, and it's really challenging. And I think one of the things we can do as a community is make, when we have the power, when we have the privilege to be able to do so, make our voices and our research and our expertise known, and show people that there are other people who are interested in this thing, and to get together and to form a group of people who are interested in that. So yeah, not really an answer, sorry, but it was just kind of to say yes, there is stuff happening.
You're muted, Margaret.
I am muted, and I was just saying that reaching out to others who have are of like mind and have a similar commitment is always a good idea, because it helps us to feel less alone in doing the work. Potentially more difficult in Africa, so my thoughts go out to you, Tosin. Look, there's a question here about language, and I was reflecting as I looked at the question that never did I imagine in previous years that being awake or woke would become an insult. And in the same way that LGBTI communities at some point in my lifetime embraced queer and decided, I am embracing woke. Excellent. Call me woke anytime you like. But the question I'm looking at, it says there's a lot of language in this area that can feel very academic and isn't necessarily accessible, feels inaccessible to some folks on the ground within emergency agencies in particular, including volunteers, and that they're often the ones who interface with the disaster responses. So are there any resources available to help those of us within emergency agencies convey the key points in more community-friendly language? This is such an interesting question, without having to recreate the wheel. I would say friendly to whom? But anyway, let me see if any of you are brave enough to tackle the question of whether this language is accessible. You've all talked about terminology.
I could start off.
Thanks, Maureen.
Not that there's a very clear answer in a way, but I think everything we're talking about is highly contextual. It really does depend on where you are, who you are, and for me, my approach tends to be to start where people are, and to try and use the language that works for them. I think what we produced was a relatively academic piece, because that was the brief that we had for pieces of research. But there are so many networks, so many discussion groups out there where people are not using academic language. So I think we don't actually have a set of resources. We don't have a set of resources like that yet. But dip into any of those networks, and then you start to see a lot more resources available that go beyond academic language. I'm sure colleagues on the talk today have some other examples of that.
Would anyone else like to add to that? Thanks, Maureen. No, there's been some additions in the chat, also interesting and useful places to go. Look, I hate to do this because we've had such a strong participation by all of you online in today's seminar. However, I do have a commitment to running on time, so I think we might have to call it there. Thank you all for your questions. And I would again like to thank Maureen, Kevin, Dayan and Tegan for your contributions today, and Dale as well for taking the time to prepare a contribution because he could not be with us. On behalf of Ada and the Gender and Disaster Australia team, thank you all so much for joining us for the webinar on gender and sexual minorities. It's such an important topic and affects disaster risk reduction activities in all phases of extreme events. So on exiting the webinar, you'll each be prompted to fill out a short survey. We do appreciate people who fill out the survey. It enables us to continue to improve our services. So please take the time to provide your feedback to us. Until next time, it's been my absolute pleasure to host today's webinar. And I wish you a good morning and a good night in the UK and in Nigeria, and stay safe and farewell.